I'll start by saying that I don't really feel nostalgia, and when I do, it's usually highly specific. This is because I had a somewhat challenging childhood. I said armchair psychology-ing myself. I grew up in a place that didn't quite accept me, so my perchance to dream has never really been about the past, but more about new places to go, new people to meet, and the chance to shun the old versions of me that I'm not particularly proud of anymore. As opposed to feeling wistful and listless about events that have happened before, triggered by things that I engage with, whether it be TV shows, movies, video games, or music, I tend to experience those emotions adjacent to myself as opposed to backwards. I've got too much of the Catholic guilt to store anything in my brain aside from all the stuff that I've done wrong in my life, so I block it out by constantly having 30 things going on at all times and torturing my very supportive partner, ooh-woo. However, and this is a pretty big however, I have this one key memory of nostalgia that hit me about 2 or 3 years ago. They put all the James Bond movies on Hulu or Paramount Plus or something, and I was bored as hell, so catch me watching all of them in a row. Depression is a hell of a drug, kids. I reached Octopussy, because of course I did. Wait, am I past the mark where in the event this video blew up, I get demonetized for saying the title of the James Bond movie? Either way. I remember very distinctively watching it with my mother when I was young. My parents spent a lot of time in bars and not so much time at home. So when I got to the movie, I still recalled this almost cherished feeling I had about the moment when my mother decided to stay home on a Friday night and watch a movie with me instead of going out. It was weird. I simultaneously enjoyed the feeling, but it also caused a lot of pain because it made me remember all the things happening around it. I could see the appeal, though. That feeling of tenderness I had when thinking about Octopussy. Actually screeching. I love that my one memorable feeling of nostalgia is over decidedly one of the worst movies in a franchise I don't actually care about. Anyway, those few moments of living in that particular moment were nice. It makes sense to me that media all across the board is attempting to appeal to nostalgia, so much so that entire subgenres of media are created and revived to mine that feeling. I'm fascinated by this. The pull of nostalgia is really strong, and I think it's only getting stronger as we continue to creep ever closer to oblivion. And listen, I can't sugarcoat that. From ecological disasters to human rights crises globally, we are living in a time of social and cultural interconnectedness. No matter where you look, you'll see horrible things that are waiting around every corner. So of course we want to slip into something a little more comfortable, remember the good times, and feel that wave of nostalgia as we try to forget the world exists for even 5 seconds, 20 minutes, or 10 hours on a Netflix binge. So how does that work exactly? As someone who truly does not feel nostalgia often, except for Octopussy, how do we manufacture nostalgia? And what's that doing to us, to the media we engage with? Whether it's remakes, reboots, vaporwave, cottagecore, or 4K restoration, nostalgia as a genre continues to dominate our media landscape, and I want to talk about why it's actually kind of cool, how it helps us to remake the present in a time where the present is exhausting. Put on some chill beats to study Sacrifice Republicans to, and take a trip with me down some memory lanes. Fleeting Memory 1. Nostalgia Classic. I think we've all got an identifiable understanding of what nostalgia is and how it's supposed to make us feel. I always like to give a working definition though. Nostalgia, or what I'm going to be calling nostalgia classic, is the triggered response of sentimentality we feel when we are reminded of the past. Writer and historian S.D. Kristauka defines nostalgia classic as homesickness, derived specifically from our understanding of Odysseus pining for his homeland as he desperately searches for a way back to his wife Penelope in the Odyssey. Kristauka suggests, however, that there is no real homecoming, safe to say that we are not exactly the same people we were when we left home, and thus we are always going to be chasing the semblance of home we left behind. Nostalgia classic is the pining we feel for what we can never have again because the past is immaterial. This is to suggest that, despite how good nostalgia feels in the moment, it loses its spark quickly, sometimes the same memories not providing us the same joy given different contexts for when we are triggering them. At its core though, nostalgia classic will always be satisfying to us because it centers on a very important person, ourselves. I read an article from The Raven called The Paradoxes of Nostalgia by Professor Kenny Walden from Dartmouth. Ooh, very fancy, I know. Which dives pretty deeply into the way we engage with nostalgia, either through agency, like when we attempt to rekindle a broken relationship with a friend we lost along the way because a memory triggers us to think about them and want to reach out, or through a self-reflexive shunning of our own importance, essentially taking comfort in the fact that the past happened, that it exists, but it's not our responsibility to necessarily do or take action on any of it. We enjoy it because we don't have to engage with it any longer. It's like watching a movie, but nothing more. Both Walden and Kristauka bring up Odysseus and Homecoming when they speak on nostalgia, and I do think that's a very specific flavor of nostalgia classic. I also love that I've started saying nostalgia classic like this after I'd already said that phrase without doing that voice. Anyway, I do think it's a very specific flavor of nostalgia classic, a sort of philosophical underpinning of the metaphysical home as a space that we cherish or curate within us, familiar bonds or kinship derived from that space, or even safety pulled from those core memories. Those were the days, people often say. Things were just better back then, my father says almost every single time I talk to him. It was just a lot safer when I was growing up. People didn't just shoot each other in public, my mother will lament on every phone call. Is this true? Was it really better back in the day? Were people really not shooting each other when they went to the movies, grocery store, or school? Or did people not have access to information instantaneously in a world that's constantly connected regardless of where you are or who you're with? I think it might be a little bit of column A and a bit of column B too. That feeds into an undercurrent that I made earlier. Our world is a messed up place. I agree, me. Thank you. But again, my lack of nostalgia doesn't really make me remember my childhood as particularly safe or better. I kind of remember the world always being pretty shitty. What people may be experiencing here is something known as the Pollyanna principle, the idea that the things in the past were better because we only tend to remember the things in the past we enjoyed more than the things we hated. And that, ladies, gents, theys, and thems, is a powerful pull of nostalgia. We're not particularly wistful or listless when we're feeling nostalgia because it makes us feel shitty, right? It's more likely we crave that homecoming to a home that could never truly exist again because it makes us feel good in some way. It gives us more than just one dopamine molecule. It may even give us 4 or 5. So it's easy to become addicted to the thing that provides us that feeling. Nostalgia classic is part of the death drive for my freaky Freudian friends out there. It's the desire to reconnect with something that's already happened, to remove ourselves from the everyday requirements and agency we have, as Walden describes. Nostalgia is a good time where you get to vibe and feel warm and welcome. No wonder we seek that shit out like it's no one's business. Nostalgia classic feels almost innate to me, truly a drive towards the inertness that Freud outlines in the death drive. In fact, I'd argue that it's the opposite side of the sublime coin. If the sublime is the incomprehensible overwhelmedness of the world, of nature, then the opposite side is nostalgia, the overwhelming desire to return to the known, the comfortable, the cloistered home. Now, in my definition for nostalgia classic, I use the phrase triggered response because I'm going to be focusing very specifically on the ways in which our engagement with media has ultimately changed because of our relationship with and ultimate desire for the feeling and connectedness we receive from nostalgia classic. Some media harkens back very specifically, using the exact style of bygone eras in an attempt to evoke nostalgia. The effect is very different depending on the media. Let's start with films like Far From Heaven and A Single Man. Both utilize similar staging, mise-en-scène, color schemes, and acting principles to evoke the 50s for Far From Heaven and the 60s for A Single Man. Both films came out in the 2000s. Both utilize these stylings to establish a specific time and place through nostalgia. Men make the money, and women make the home. You can be gay, but it's impolite to talk about it. There are spaces for black people and white people, but don't mix. The trappings of these classic-style melodramas highlight that things really haven't changed that much for most minority groups since the 50s and 60s. Nostalgia, in this case, actualized through near imitation of old aesthetics, proves to us that the comfort and class of the past were really built on the backs of everyone that wasn't a straight white man. The sadness of Far From Heaven, directed by Todd Haynes, is the disillusionment of a marriage between a woman and her quickly realizing gay husband. The taboo of divorce and homosexuality is juxtaposed between the tender and ultimately snuffed relationship that the main character Kathy develops with her black gardener Raymond. The tropes and the melodrama highlight and disparage the idealization that, like, Leave It to Beaver espoused. Far From Heaven's relationship with homosexuality is especially interesting given that it's based off of old Douglas Sirk films, including Written on the Wind, a film starring Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was a closeted gay man for much of his career until later in life when he was diagnosed with HIV and then later died of the disease. Wild speculation, a marriage to a woman, and lots of work to undermine other people's careers to keep himself out of the paper. Many of Hudson's challenges in his life and career are echoed in Frank's, Kathy Gay's husband, there's a lot of apostrophe S's in there, attempt to convert himself to heterosexuality. Far From Heaven's nostalgia is a powerful indictment of the way we still engage in conversations around gender, race, and sexuality. We are meant to question our fond memories. A Single Man, directed by Tom Ford, feels like it uses its nostalgia trappings more for style than substance, and that's honestly fine by me because the film is absolutely gorgeous. Julianne Moore was really out here just being the new Lauren Bacall for a hot second, and we love that for her. A Single Man concerns itself with the escalating desire of the main character, George Falconer, to end his life. The beauty of the shot composition, conversations, and political underpinnings of the 60s is meant to portray everything that George is unallowed to have since the death of his lover, Jim. He's constantly reminded of his inability to be George Falconer through interactions with his kind neighbor that genuinely wants to form a connection with him, but her husband describes George as strange and light in his loafers. He has an almost parasitic relationship with his best friend Charlie, and don't get me wrong, it goes both ways, reminding him of the constant pull of heterosexuality in an unkind world. Finally, he begins to fall for one of his college students, a cruel reminder of the loss of his youth. Ford and company enact melodrama and sentimentality to provide the viewer with a bleak world for those that are different, but proves private moments are still worth fighting for. Maybe an invitation to a neighbor's party can be enough. Maybe drinks with your bestie can help you carry on. And maybe a smile from some cute guy can remind you that it's okay to be you. These brief moments of enjoyment are highlighted with sudden shocks into Technicolor. Most of the film is gray, symbolizing George's inability to connect, but in these snapshots with people in his life, where he does get to feel like George, the film erupts into vibrant color, where both George and the audience can understand the elegance of existing in an idealized time, Tom Ford's 60s. It's all fleeting though, and no amount of kind interactions can save George from fate, even if it isn't from his own hand. Now, you may be saying, Oliver, I'm a TikTok teen. I don't know what it means to feel nostalgia for the 50s and 60s because that's history. And well, we'll get to that actually. My main point here is that we sometimes go for straightforward nostalgia classic because it provides us with an understood place of sentimentality. Much like our conversations about genre and the way those genre pieces help to quickly inform a picture or context for what we're watching, our use of nostalgia classic creates a stark contrast between what's happening now and how we are expected to understand whatever it is that we are being called to remember. This is a powerful tool in our consumption of nostalgia, a sort of collective unconsciousness of sentimentality? Even if you haven't experienced the 50s and 60s, you're probably still aware of some of these tropes, which leads us ever closer to nostalgia as a genre in and of itself. Alright, you TikTok teens, I'll leave you with one more example of nostalgia classic from the recent times. The game Evil West by Flying Wild Hog. I was very interested in this game when it was first announced, and I found it fascinating that almost every review I read of it said that it was like playing a PlayStation 3 era action game. My mind immediately erupted to Devil May Cry 4, Dante's Inferno, Dead Space, and several others, and it turns out that's what other people were feeling too. Is Evil West a carbon copy in the way that Far From Heaven and A Single Man evoke old melodrama? I can only say yes from what I've seen in playthroughs and reviews, but honestly, Evil West looks like a PlayStation 3 game in Unreal 5. From its story beats, enemy variety, gameplay, and difficulty, I'd say the game is very specifically for a core demographic, and it harkens to the nostalgia that a lot of PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 action game players have probably been wanting. It's also more nostalgia classic, actually, than my nostalgia classic, than my film examples, because Evil West doesn't even really invite us to question the nostalgia classic. It sort of exists for you to feel comfort in it. And much like the individuality of nostalgia classic itself, Evil West sold well to the people that would enjoy a game like Evil West, and folks outside of that core demographic seem to have a harder time understanding its appeal. Ooh, I actually thought of another example, and I know what you're thinking. Like, Oliver, don't you edit these? Can't you just go back and make the other, like, bit not say that it was the last example and this is the last example? I could do that, but I think this is funnier, so shh. I've seen a lot of recent sitcoms attempting sort of the same gambit as Evil West. There's been a bit of a boom of multi-camera sitcoms in the last couple of years, similar in structure and gag style to Friends and other early 90s sitcoms. It's been really interesting to see like the dethroning of the single camera style that erupted in the 2000s with 30 Rock, The Office, Parks and Rec, and all of those. While some of these shows do not attempt to break out of familiar trappings at all, I'd say that there are some, like The Neighborhood, Bob Hart's Abishola, and Call Me Kat, where they do attempt to kind of break the mold by presenting us with situations that could enact good, groundbreaking comedy. But instead, they pull closely to the nostalgia classic tropes of the past multi-camera sitcoms and end up failing because of it. Still, the power of nostalgia classic is strong, and many of these shows still do well, which is why most of them have 3 or more seasons with current renewals for additional seasons. The important thing to note here, though, is that they are original, using nostalgia as a tool to engage the audience and make us feel more comfortable and happy in the days of Cheers and, well, happy days. That's important because nostalgia classic occupies a strange space these days. What still exists of it is ultimately overshadowed by the most prominent form of nostalgia. So let's talk about fleeting memory number 2, Daddy Cap's nostalgia. Well, capitalism, the thing that, you know what? No, I'm not making a joke about capitalism ruining everything. We already know capitalism ruins everything. Capitalism's ability to warp just about everything into a wolf in sheep's clothing is impressive, and it's no different for nostalgia. When I consider how capitalism affects the things that we create, there are 3 essential things I see. A recreation of the old masters as a cash grab, following current trends as a cash grab, and mashing genres pretending it's something new as a cash grab. Nostalgia's relationship with daddy capitalism is indeed a cash grab, and we primarily see this in the way that we blatantly rip off or reproduce for immediate emotional responses, knowing full well that we are often too tired to challenge or too cautious to attempt something new. This form of nostalgia under capitalism, or what I'm going to call daddy cap nostalgia, I need to come up with a fun way of saying that, functions not as a triggered response, but often as an overly cloying saturation of prescribed images to force a response. This is why I think a large cross-section of people quickly grow tired of films, TV shows, games, etc. that feed too heavily upon nostalgia, because Daddy Cap's nostalgia comes across as insincere, and above all, in it for the money. Nostalgia being sold out in its highest form. Well, how is that different from nostalgia classic, though, Oliver? The examples I gave above seem to pull from the old masters and reproduce them, you're right. While I would argue that nostalgia is used almost as a literary device in my first examples, Far From Heaven and A Single Man, in which they use these melodrama Turner classic movie tropes to exemplify and subvert our normal feelings of nostalgia to call into question what we are nostalgic for. Even Evil West and those multicam sitcoms are new IPs that exist less as an overt cash grab and more of a loving and something that is hoping that you'll really buy into it, enticement of the past. Evil West, for better or worse, exists to remind us of an era that appeals to a specific group of people ready to experience that very specific PS3 and Xbox 360 lifestyle. It doesn't try to be anything other than a throwback. Daddy Cap's nostalgia is more invested in broad strokes and least common denominator tactics to appeal to and simplify for the main purpose of mass production. Now, I know this might make some of you mad, but I think the absolute best example of Daddy Cap's nostalgia currently is Stranger Things. Everything about Stranger Things is something else. Every moment I felt like I was watching that show, I was just watching other things sewn together from random 80s movies, The X-Files, Silent Hill, Stephen King, and a laundry list of other references. It'd take most of the rest of this video to list out. And listen, I'm learning art, and I believe references are great, but when your list of references is longer than one of the episodes of your TV series, you're not referencing things anymore, you're just cherry picking. And it's the very reason I stopped watching Stranger Things halfway through season 2. I couldn't see anything that I didn't already know. Everything seemed to exist solely to remind me of something else I'd already engaged with. It didn't allow nostalgia to like wash over me like an herbal essence commercial. It didn't put me in a state of being, a feeling of homecoming, something primal. It was like, did you see that? Okay, but did you see that? And I was like, yeah, yeah, Stranger Things, I did. Can we watch something else, please? I'd really like to watch something else. At which point Stranger Things just like pointed at me and reminded me that it was the most watched television series of all time or whatever. And then I politely asked Stranger Things to leave my home. And that shit is like everywhere now. It's children's Halloween costumes, it's board games. I've heard that they might be making a video game. There are potential spin-offs happening left and right. I could have sworn that I saw that it was a comic, or maybe the comic series was just announced, probably at IDW. Ugh, nostalgia in this case exists solely for facade. In Nostalgia, a polemic written by Kathleen Stewart, she states, nostalgia rises to importance as a cultural practice as culture becomes more and more diffuse, more and more a structure of feeling, as culture takes on the power of distance that comes of displacing speakers, the power to flatten distinctions, to blur genres, to unname the practices of the social world so that they look like nature. Our world becomes ever more globalized, and our sense of self within a widening culture breaks down our ability to see ourselves represented in our own individuality. By creating media, specifically like Stranger Things, with its laundry list of references and cultural collateral, we find a space where large swaths of people are allowed to remember, and I'm going to put that in quotes, some semblance of self within cultural zeitgeists. And god damn it, does Gen X want us to remember the 80s? Too long, didn't read. Daddy capitalism assumes you feel disconnected, and by using media that harkens to nostalgia, it hopes to make you feel connected again, but this comes at the cost of cashing in on the very nostalgia it's hoping you'll buy into. The danger here is that Daddy Cap's nostalgia hopes you'll buy the action figures, those tie-in games, the comic from IDW. It uses this nostalgia as a marketing tool, and it works. The nostalgia itself also has to be very decentralized to work. It can't be Evil West and its mass market appeal to dude bros that still have their backwards compatible PlayStation 3s that cost $600 that they had to camp outside of a Best Buy for 3 days to get. And like, Scream's been doing the same thing for like the last 3 sequels. Each one mimics the first 2 while simultaneously using its tongue-in-cheek humor to make you feel like you're laughing along with the fact that they've told you the same story 3 times. It's so indebted to its past that when it lost its main star, it just further anchored its new star to a character from the first movie to weirdly bizarre effect. Daddy issues to the extreme. The wild thing here is that Scream itself used nostalgia of slasher films to produce its unique sense of humor. After Scream 2, though, that nostalgia shifted from nostalgia classic, a triggered response to make you feel good about those past experiences, and turned it into a franchise machine under Daddy Cap nostalgia. Don't even get me started on those aughts like horror remakes where Daddy Cap nostalgia tried to cash in on the success of Daddy Cap's Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. Reboots of classic sitcoms like Murphy Brown also hope to capitalize on the same remember when feeling while shifting the script from being politically bent to broad comedy appeal. I've seen several other reboots that take the scathing commentary of the original series and diffuse, to use Stewart's word, and try to broach that mass market appeal. Now, I do think this is different than those somewhat rote sitcoms I mentioned in our section on Nostalgia Classic, because most of those are original concepts fueled by nostalgia with generally new setups, where most of these reboots are taking old concepts that were usually pushing the envelope in one way or another, removing all the teeth, and repackaging them as nostalgia milk straight from Daddy Cap's teat. So, the big question. Does this matter? Short answer, yes. Daddy Cap's nostalgia has turned nostalgia from being a literary device and space for wistful reminiscing, and turned it into a literal genre. Nostalgia as a genre may not seem like that big of a deal, but constantly peddling media that suggests that things were just better back then, or remember when movies were fun like the 80s, and even remember the last movie you watched in the series? Well, this movie from 2 years later is here to remind you to reminisce about that movie from 2 years ago. It undermines and trivializes the amazing work of people that are trying to push art and entertainment forward in powerful and fascinating ways. Inundating people with the lie that yesterday was better than today, I truly believe, is also responsible for the way that people consider politics, relationships, and identity. I have friends and coworkers whose personalities are the 90s were the best and everything coming out now can never compare, it's trash. Beach, have you seen 911 Lone Star? Hot gays, volcanoes in Austin, and Gina Torres hanging with Rob Lowe? Get out of here. Now, Oliver, are you saying it's bad for people to feel nostalgic about these things? Is it really hurting someone to have the personality trait I love the 80s on VH1? I wholly subscribe to the philosophy that if you do something that does not hurt others or yourself, then you should be free to do it however you see fit. But I do think it's reasonable to provide feedback, and I think having your entire personality be that one decade is better than all the others is, well, it's a bit limiting, don't you think? Returning to Kathleen Stewart's Nostalgia, a Polemic, I was struck by the line, nostalgia, like the economy it runs with, is everywhere, but it is a cultural practice, not a given content. Its form, meanings, and effects shift with the context. It depends on where the speaker stands in the landscape of the present. Even as nostalgia has become a genre, and even as nostalgia diffuses with culture, one thing remains consistent in Stewart's assertions, as with Walden and Kristauka. Nostalgia is still a deeply personal feeling. It's still centered in the individual and where they are in the present. So what happens exactly when individuals decide to reframe their present with nostalgia, as opposed to using nostalgia to prime us for the past? Fleeting memory numéro 3. Nouveau nostalgique. I recently started playing Chained Echoes, a 16-bit JRPG developed by Matthias Linda. I was immediately struck by its story, character setting, and graphics. Like I said in a previous video, and probably like in most of my TikToks, most of my favorite video games are from the 16-bit era, so getting the opportunity to play Chained Echoes was quite fun. Its battle system in particular stand out to me because of the comboing that happens between each character and their skill sets. Linda wears the game's inspiration on his sleeve in interviews, and most reviews hailed it as an incredible piece of nostalgia that could, and I quote, sit among the greats of the 16-bit era. That struck me. The entire time I was playing Chained Echoes, I was feeling some semblance of nostalgia, but as I narrowed into the feeling, I realized the nostalgia I felt was wrong, or maybe not wrong, but different? I didn't feel a sense of homecoming like I was sitting on the floor in front of a CRT TV at 8 years old trying to beat that stupid tiger boss in the Light Palace in Secret of Mana for the 1000th time. No, Chained Echoes was triggering a different kind of nostalgia for me. Its battle system is too sophisticated, its plotting feels too imbued with New World sensibilities, and its character motivations and backgrounds may harken back to the old days, but they're a little too complicated. Chained Echoes was making me feel nouveau nostalgique, les gasps. Okay, like I doubt I'm ever gonna be popular, and that's fine with me. I just enjoy making these little videos for myself and for the few people that actually watch them. I hope you enjoy it too, viewers, but I just think that the French will never enjoy me. And we're back. So, nouveau nostalgique is a sudden and inexplicable feeling of nostalgia for something you've never experienced before or would be impossible for you to feel nostalgia classic about. Chained Echoes could have been a 16-bit JRPG ripoff, utilizing Daddy Cap's nostalgia to cash in on a crowd looking to feel nostalgic about a popular and off-cited point of video game history, but instead, it uses Nostalgia Classic as a starting point to build a new kind of adventure that conceptualizes and redefines 16-bit JRPGs for the present. In essence, Chained Echoes exists as a game I wish I had played in 1993, but there is no way it would have been made then. It wouldn't have queer characters. Its reflections on religion and fate wouldn't really exist until many years later when Chrono Cross and Xenogears started adding psychological and existential elements into the JRPG mix. It is impossible for me to feel nostalgia for Chained Echoes, and yet, I do. I feel nostalgia for what Chained Echoes represents, a past memory that exists in my present. My past experience is truly being rewritten by playing the game now, like right now, while I'm writing this. I'm telling you, this is why it has taken me 8 months to come out with a new video. Playing a game with one hand and writing with the other is just an impossibility. Resonance by Home? Or is it Home by Resonance? I've never known, and at this point, I'm actually just like a little too afraid to ask. I think it's a great example of this as well. I remember when this song came out about 8 years ago. It was the first time I'd heard anything like it. Now we call it synthwave, which has inspired the likes of vaporwave and ethereal wave, dark minimalism wave, vaporwave's cousin, Vic's vapor rub wave, and my favorite, no wave. I was also gonna say, like, very genuinely here that, like, Resonance by Home started synthwave, but I realized in saying that someone would eventually be like, actually, DJ Doggy Door put out a song called Vaporwaves Off My Back While My Waifu Body Pillow Bangs Me in the Ass While Reading Chuck Tingle's The Manifestation of My Waifu Body Pillow Teaches Me Social Studies While Banging Me in the Ass. Why the hell do you think it's called Vaporwave? And honestly, I just don't have the emotional fortitude for that right now. So I'll just say Resonance by Home was a very influential song in the wave genre. The point here, comment after comment at time of its release, and some even now, talk about how Resonance made them feel nostalgia. Several of these comments, though, directly referenced how it made the listener feel nostalgic for something they'd never experienced before. The wave movement summons the 80s aesthetic of thumping basses and electric keyboards, and I'll admit when I first heard Resonance by Home, or Home by Resonance, we'll never know, it did make me feel a certain way. I still remember it. It wasn't nostalgia for the 80s, that's impossible. I grew up in the 90s. It triggered a nostalgic feeling about a space that never existed for me. The fact of the matter is, Resonance isn't a love letter to the 80s, but a re-examination of its aesthetic, reproduced through modern sensibilities. It's the same as Chained Echoes. The nouveau nostalgique of the song permeates through communities, and I've seen many people claim it's what got them into synth and vaporwave. Many of those folks are people that weren't born in the era of the aesthetic. The wave movement, again, rewrites the present as both the centering of the nostalgia for the listener, as well as creating a space that doesn't actually exist and inviting listeners to be nostalgic for it. I find a very similar thing in Caroline Rose's album Loner, specifically songs like Jeannie Becomes a Mom and More of the Same. There's a kind of synth style that constantly makes me feel like I'm supposed to be remembering something or feeling nostalgic for something, but it's always on the tip of my tongue. It gives the songs almost dreamlike qualities, simultaneously being very modern while also being out of time. Given the song's subject matters, it also plays deeply into the themes of repetition, loss of control, and looped experiences. Walden says we can aestheticize our remembering, as he talks about the exhaustion that comes from attempting to enact agency over nostalgia. He suggests that if we trouble nostalgia, reminding ourselves that meaning isn't fixed, you can see my video on The Author is Dead after you finish watching this one, we can constantly see our nostalgia in a different light. This can keep us from feeling trapped in the past or overwhelmed by the feelings we were never really able to overcome or the things we missed out on. Nouveau nostalgique is doing this in reverse, though. It's creating troubled nostalgia, where media that enacts nostalgia classic either invites us to live in a less complicated time or recalls the past to problematize our memories of better times. Nouveau nostalgique cuts out the middleman and says, no. We're not going to make you remember the past to examine it. We're simply going to create a new past in the present and make you experience this new past without the complications of your past self. Ooh la la! Nouveau nostalgique exists beyond remembrance, beyond capitalism. Nouveau nostalgique is what happens when you've cultivated nostalgia as a genre for so long that we believe things were so much better in the past that we've reclaimed our present through an aesthetic of the past as opposed to a simple recreation. It's creator-driven, a space for authors of all kind to create through their own memories and nostalgia to form something new, and they invite us along to experience their nostalgia and our own. Nouveau nostalgique doesn't ask us to compare and contrast or simply enjoy existing in our memories of the past. It wants us to imagine the past we wish we had, with the music, movies, games, and shows we're being presented with. It allows nostalgia's centering of the self as a means of catharsis to exist while we're making new memories about present things reminding us of an impossible past. Fucking wild, dude. We see this in cottagecore. Many people feel this unyielding urge to return to the pastoral, big P, because the modern metropolis as a dream is daunting and impossible because money, space, and control. Cottagecore represents a simpler time through the modern meaning of chosen isolationism. Many cottagecore folks want to be witches in the woods with herb gardens and reclaimed furniture and kitsch. Cottagecore uses past aesthetics to rewrite what the pastoral means. It's no longer the heartland or farmers or a simpler way of life. But instead, it represents those things as an obtainable and sustainable goal, a controlled environment, and a space that someone can call their own. It mixes the rugged individualism of growing up in a capitalistic society and reimagines it through a return to nature. I think people might argue this point with me a little bit, but that's okay. Modern video game remakes. I would argue that depending on the remake, these either exist in Daddy Cap's nostalgia, or they exist in Nouveau Nostalgique. The main difference here is the reason for recreation. I'd say things like The Last of Us Part 1, which I've argued before exists solely as a marketing tool, fits squarely in Daddy Cap's nostalgia. It's asking us to feel nostalgic for something that's less than 10 years old and came out to me wholly to promote the upcoming television show. The Resident Evil 2 remake instills a feeling of nouveau nostalgique. It was remixed enough, its characters and story rewritten in a way that encouraged me to feel like I was experiencing 1998 as if it were the present. By their definition, remakes exist to get consumers to buy a product they've already bought before, but they also exist in a place, much like Chained Echoes, where they can take the bygone, the past aesthetic, and force us to experience it again in the present, which I think creates that out-of-time feeling, which is nouveau nostalgique. The Dead Space remake teeters this line more than anything else that comes to mind. Very much the same game, but at the same time updated enough that it always made me feel like I was playing the game that I wish I was playing in 2008. Because of that feeling, I kept mentioning to my partner how richer the experience was. It felt like it was created by a team that loved the original, but wished we had our present experience, technology, and aesthetics applied to it. For that reason, it worked for me. It felt genuine. While it doesn't exist in the exact same way, I do think this fits into my point above, specifically about TikTok teens not feeling nostalgia classic for films that evoke nostalgia classic as a literary device. I'm the same as you TikTok teens, just less cool. I can't feel nostalgia for the 50s and 60s nor the 70s and 80s, but I can feel the tangential nostalgic elements that are evoked by filmmakers using aesthetics to recreate and challenge the past. It's the same kind of feeling I get when I watch old horror movies and see practical effects. I can't feel nostalgia for being young and seeing those movies for the first time, but I do get a tangential feeling of nouveau nostalgique, and I think this is because these films are genuine. They aren't necessarily touched by Daddy Cap's nostalgia to cash in because they came out before Daddy Cap decided to trade in on their cherished elements. See all those 2000s horror remakes I mentioned above. I'm creating nostalgia in my present by watching films of the past. I think this is why, sometimes, older films feel more raw, unhinged, and dirty. There's an unfiltered touch to them that we get to examine through our current understanding of aesthetics. So, speaking on that, and in a different direction, but kind of the same, let's talk quickly about restoration and re-releases. A lot of films get 4K re-releases these days, and I think this plays into the above, which teeters that same line that the Dead Space remake does. For many audience members, 4K restorations and re-releases may be the first time and only way to see a lot of these films. Restorations have been an amazing way to introduce out-of-print and old films to new audiences. While some of these are cash grabs, the ones that exist almost purely to save films in question, something that you see a lot with the Criterion Collection doing a lot of work, these reify films as something both fixed in the past, but now they're readily available in the present. This creates the same out-of-time feeling that some of my previous examples evoked, and the fact that many of these films go on to have theater showings decades after their original release presents them in the cultural zeitgeist to many audience members for the first time as a cinematic experience. This doesn't change the past aesthetic like vaporwave or new 16-bit games, but it does recontextualize them, which presents as nouveau nostalgique, as we ingest things from the past using and understanding our current cultural aesthetic in a setting that resembles exactly how they would have been seen originally when they were released. I think it's so dope to go see old restored movies in theaters and feel like you're getting to experience it just like the people who got to see it for the very first time whenever it came out. Nouveau nostalgique is the logical step forward in Daddy Cap's nostalgia, since it returns our cultural understanding of nostalgia, bled dry through capitalism and broad market appeal, back to the individual. Individuals then invite us into their own understanding of nostalgia to create sensory feelings I truly believe are only possible to us in our current cultural aesthetic. Fleeting memory for, or returning home. Playing nostalgia as a form of expression or relational experience can be a powerful tool for engaging audiences in a myriad of ways. We've learned this. I'm rarely interested in making blanket statements like trading on nostalgia is bad or nostalgia is a cheap way of exploiting the audience's emotions, because there's so much media out there now. If you're not interested in nostalgia as a genre like Daddy Cap has given us, then just avoid it. Again, while I think it's legitimate to be critical of the way in which Daddy Cap nostalgia has constantly reified the concept that the past is better than the present ever could be, some cloying sentimentality every now and again is only human, and I seek it out too. I'm really interested in seeing how Nouveau Nostalgique continues to grow as a form of consciousness and art, and I'm even more interested to see how capitalism ultimately assimilates it. I know that sounds so deterministic, maybe a little nihilistic too, but that's kind of the nature of the beast, and it doesn't worry me because we constantly evolve our aesthetic, our understanding of subjects, and sources to craft new movements and genres all the time. While I am firmly anti-capitalist, I don't often think that it just obliterates art movements. It does repurpose them until clever people get tired and create something brand new, and I'm always excited to see what that looks like. Now, I've been pondering this the entire time I've been writing, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm not a thesis statement in a conclusion kind of guy, and it's really hurting me, but here we are, and so we're gonna just work through this together. But what does all of this mean? The original purpose was to discuss nostalgia as I've seen it evolve over my lifetime, and honestly, I am loving Nouveau Nostalgique, and the way I say it, and the way it makes me feel, especially as someone that doesn't feel nostalgia classic normally. Having spaces outside of my own memories that make me feel like I have a past that isn't mired by all the other shitty experiences I was experiencing is exciting. It fuels me to discover even more spaces in art and culture that can produce this feeling for me. I feel like part of the club, except my club is riding my light cycle down a neon 80s hellscape with thumping no wave playing in my retro brain headphone implants, feeling like the manic pixie dream beast I always knew I could be, instead of remembering the thrill of everyone knowing that I was the lead jock and prom king in high school. Similar feeling though, really, I swear. And bam, that's it. That's the why. That's the catalyst for the evolution in nostalgia. A lot of us didn't have the classic experiences of nostalgia classic. Many of us were bullied as children, came from broken households, lost people dear to us, or got kicked out of our homes for being gay. Maybe family members have been in prison for a long time, or we were hungry or cold in a world filled with foods and warm clothes. The default of nostalgia classic trades on experiences that most people don't actually get to experience. But it's what we idealize as the cultural aesthetic of nostalgia. Many of us aren't prom kings or queens. Many of us didn't share in our love of football with our dads, so Thanksgiving games with the Cowboys and the Lions or whatever don't hold significance. A lot of us had poor Christmases with people we no longer talk to. Nostalgia classic, used as a literary device to call into question what better times means, is a powerful tool, or nostalgia classic used to bring us to very specific points in the past where we can experience something that's kind of fleeting and nice to exist in again, certainly works, because we sense that it's genuine. But the broad strokes of Daddy Cap nostalgia is often trading on a nostalgia that many of us just never experienced, and that is why it feels disingenuous and cloying to so many of us. When we try to capitalize on broad understanding of nostalgia as we see in Daddy Cap's nostalgia, a lot of money and interest is generated, no doubt. Hello, Stranger Things. Capitalism's only real power, though, is monetization, which really leads to misinterpreting nostalgia into a kitchen sink mentality, where the best way to find an audience is by filling your content with anything that could pull in any cross-section of people. A lot of these stories continue to exist in the default, though. They are straight and white. Their minority characters are often underwritten or exist as tropes to push the narrative along, or to exist as representation for the sake of saying you've got representation. This furthers the narrative that those days that were so much better were better because of a very narrow scope and outlook on who was experiencing the good times. Daddy Cap's nostalgia reifies the worst part of nostalgia classic, because that's really all it can do. While I won't indict people for trying to cash in, I will indict the fact that they often do so by playing into a system that perpetuates stilted storytelling that centers straight white culture, and I do think that that's dangerous. I honestly believe that this is why cottagecore is so popular amongst young queer people. Many grew up in straight white religious households that preached control of the body through modesty and repression. Going to be a witch in the woods or whatever centers agency, communal living with nature, and magic that's about taking power through permission and balance instead of relinquishing control. A lot of people that I know, specifically queer women, have really taken to synthwave and darkwave, especially as a favorite form of music and a retreat for them. A lot of queer writers of color are reclaiming dystopian novels, warping the old guard to describe how a lot of dystopian fiction is just what would happen if white people had to deal with the everyday horrors of being a person of color. That's why Nouveau Nostalgique is so cool. It isn't just a reaction to Daddy Cap nostalgia, it's a proactive movement of people that want to remake the present by creating a pantheon of art that exists to modernize the past. It doesn't just show, well, things haven't really changed that much, now have they? But instead demands that we recognize the past is not the default. The past does not exist in the same way for everyone as popular culture tries to impress upon us. Nouveau Nostalgique shows us that home looks different for people, that the artifacts we've been chasing, the home we've been trying to reach again, are wild and disparate, and the best we can do is see these new visions of the past by challenging who we are in the present. Nostalgia is complicated and individualistic, but I like this Nouveau Nostalgique. I want to see more of the new past. I want more people to remember a past with diverse stories. I love that we are remaking our present. This feels like a home worth coming back to.